Welcome to The Jewish Lens, a podcast to discuss anything and everything from a Jewish perspective. Now, please help me welcome the man who controls the media, your host, Jonathan Rosen.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of The Jewish Lens. I'm Jonathan Rosen, and today I'd like to welcome an author of a very interesting book about Charles Lindbergh called A Convenient Villain. Please help me welcome Dr. Jon D. Jon, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we have a lot to cover, but I always like to start by going back with people. So let's start by going back with you. Where did you grow up, and what was your family life like, in particular with regard to Judaism?
So I was born at the United States Air Force Academy Hospital.
Oh, wow.
My father was a captain in the Air Force, and my mother was a graduate student in history. So you can see where these interests, how these two different interests merged in my life. I grew up in North Miami Beach, Florida. My father,
my neck of the woods now.
Yeah, my father was a cardiologist. Mm-hmm. He left the Air Force, moved us to North Miami Beach, and I grew up with four Jewish grandparents. My mother made Shabbat dinner every Friday night. I have three brothers, one older, two younger. My father sent me to Israel when I turned 18.
He sent you?
He sent me. He said, "You're going to Israel this summer," and off I went with a youth group, and then I went back for almost 2 years. I went to Ben Gurion University for a while to get a master's degree in engineering. I tried to work for the Israeli aircraft industry. I had worked for them as a consultant after I graduated from college. So I took my aerospace engineering degree from Columbia, and I went to Israel and was there for over a year, learned Hebrew, because Ben Gurion University is a Hebrew-speaking university.
And you still speak fluently. That's always really.
I still speak Hebrew, yeah. And then I came back to the United States, went to medical school, did my residency and fellowship at Emory. I'm a cardiologist. I was in practice for 17 years in Florida. And during that time, I did a lot of work fighting anti-Semitism. If you look over my right shoulder, there's a certificate from the Israeli government from 2003 awarding me a commendation for bringing a dozen people to Israel during 2002, 2003, when very few people were going to Israel. So if you Google me, you'll see a lot of my letters to the editor about Israel and fighting for Jewish causes.
I'm already impressed about some of the things that we do have in common. I mean, my father was in the Navy. He also taught history. I lived in Israel also for a few years. So my Hebrew is not fluent, though. It's still choppy. I went a few years ago for the first time since I was a kid, and I was impressed with how much I remembered, but I still I wouldn't say fluent. So I got to know. So were you interested in writing when you were a kid at all, or no? And no one.
I wrote a lot of medical journal articles. I did a lot of technical writing. Mm-hmm. I'd always wanted to write a book, but never anything. I never had an idea what I was going to write about. During the pandemic, I read Andrew Scott Berg's book about Charles Lindbergh, that won the Pulitzer Prize.
Yeah, I'm going to definitely get to that. But but as a kid, you definitely weren't interested in pursuing writing or anything like that.
No. First was engineering, and then medicine.
So I was also reading. Okay, you're a cardiologist now. That you developed a life-saving screening technique for congenital heart disease?
I didn't develop it. I mean, a lot of people developed it, but I was one of the first ones to test it clinically. We all had this idea simultaneously about screening newborns, and I published one of the first papers on it that had over 2,000 babies, and it worked. Other people worked on it also. I wasn't the only one, but I was the first one.
What is the technique? What's the... That's what I was all curious when I was reading this.
So a pulse oximeter checks your oxygen saturation. Everybody's had one of them if they've been in the hospital or got anesthesia. We just decided we were going to try it on every newborn. And if it was below a certain number, they would get an ultrasound. It sounds simple, and it was simple, but there were questions that needed to be answered, like how many echocardiograms would it generate? Would it generate so many echocardiograms that it wasn't financially feasible? How much would it cost to do this? And so someone had to try it on a couple thousand babies to see, is it just generating normal echocardiograms? And I was the one who did that. And then eventually a lot of other people did bigger studies, 50,000 kids. Eventually in 2010, HHS, Health and Human Services, recommended it. And now every state in the country does it. It's part of the newborn, before the newborn can leave the hospital. they get the screening test.
Oh, that's fantastic. So, okay, so some of the things you said. So you came from a family that loved history already. So some of the things that I was reading about you, because one of the things that's mentioned about you is that your love of history came from a course at Columbia. So that's not accurate at all.
I took a class on World War II history at Columbia.
Okay.
And when I applied to medical school, I asked that professor to write me a letter of recommendation. I still have it. Mm-hmm. And he wrote a letter of recommendation that was different than all the chemistry professors and other people that write letters of recommendation over and over again. And when I was on my medical school interviews, people asked me about this letter in particular. And what he said was that he'd forgotten something. He'd forgotten who the four candidates were that ran for president in 1948. And I knew the names of the four candidates. That's what my mother wrote her thesis about. Wow. So that was in the letter. And the medical professors, after reading recommendation letter after recommendation letter from chemistry professors, read something from a history professor and found it very interesting. So I got a lot of questions about that when I applied to medical school, about that particular letter of recommendation.
That's amazing. Okay. So, all right. So before we dive deeper into it, I have a lot of questions about the book itself. So can you give like a brief synopsis of A Convenient Villain before we dive a little deeper?
Okay. So Charles Lindbergh is one of the most controversial figures in American history. To the Jews, his legacy comes from a different generation. It comes from my grandparents' generation. Now, our grandparents, I loved my grandparents, but they were insecure about their role in America. They were immigrants or the children of immigrants. Famous Americans like Eleanor Roosevelt said, the Jews aren't really Americans yet. And they were threatened by Lindbergh. Lindbergh threatened their identity. It wasn't what he said, because most of what he said was true. It was the fact that he said it at all. The fact that he talked about the role of Jewish Americans in the political process. But we had every right to be in the political process. We were American citizens. We had the same rights as every other American. But to my grandparents, that was threatening. So I started writing the book because as an aerospace engineer, I realized that Andrew Scott Berg didn't really understand the engineering part of it. And that's a big part of the book. And I talk to pilots and I talk to aviation people all the time. But to the Jews, the part that is interesting is, why were they threatened? What was threatening? And to us, fourth generation American, why isn't it threatening? I can read what he said now and say, okay, well, this is the answer we should have given, but nobody gave an answer. We let the non-Jews answer for us, and that's always a mistake. We always have to speak for ourselves.
Okay, from what you just said, okay, because you just said it, you've heard all the stories. Growing up, I heard all these negative stories about Lindbergh too. So you've mentioned the book a little bit, which I'd like to go into a little bit more now. So what made you decide to write about him as well as take this angle?
So I started off about engineering. I thought I would just write a magazine article about when he went to Germany. So in 1935, he moves to Europe. His son is kidnapped in 1932. The guy is caught in 1934, Hauptmann. There's a trial. And the sensationalism of the trial threatens his surviving son, Jon Lindbergh, his second son. So Charles and Ann Lindbergh get on a boat and go to Europe in December 1935. He's in Europe. He's invited to go to Germany by the American embassy on a spying mission. It's an espionage mission. And he collects all this intelligence. And when I read Berg's book, I realized that Berg didn't understand the intelligence. He didn't understand how important it was. He didn't understand how revolutionary it was for American air power. Lindbergh comes back to the United States in April 1939, starts visiting every manufacturer of airplane components on his own dime. He never asked for a penny from the United States government. And I follow how that led to the development of world-class engines, but engines that could fight the Germans, that could fight the Japanese. Airplanes that were combat equivalent. That's one part of the story. That's not the reason I'm on your podcast. I'm on your podcast about the Jewish part of the story. Then he becomes, in September 1939, Germany invades Poland. Roosevelt gives a speech and says, we're not going to enter the war unless we're attacked. Lindbergh gives a radio address September 15th, 1939, which begins his career as an isolationism. Why doesn't he want the United States to enter the war? He gives 4 reasons. In October 1939, he gives a radio address. He gives 4 reasons. Every one of those reasons came true. 1, the Russians will dominate Europe, came true. 2, we'll have an enormous debt. The debt the United States generated was not paid back until 2006. Number three, there will be a famine in Europe after the war is over. Absolutely happened. The fourth thing is fascinating. He said, if we enter this war in Europe, we will never be able to extricate ourselves from European affairs. Absolutely happened, and right now we're in the middle of it. It's 50 years since he passed away, and we're still dealing with European affairs. So his basis for not entering the war was perfectly valid, and the Jews were not even part of this advocacy until like day 700 of his advocacy. He was an isolationist for 826 days. He doesn't even mention the Jews till day 715. He gives one speech in Des Moines, Iowa,
Right.
in which he says, American Jews want to enter the war. That is their right. If you don't think they're being persecuted in Germany, you have no sense of dignity. But this is dangerous for us and for them, because he feels like we're going to enter the war the way we entered World War I. There's going to be a ginned up, casus belli. Roosevelt is going to come up with some reason to enter the war. We're going to get obliterated because the Germans are so much more ready for this than we are. And we're going to blame the Jews. The American people will blame the Jews for the casualties. The American people will blame the Jews for the cost. And he says, unless we discuss this now, there's going to be an anti-Semitic outburst. And I am the only person who can discuss this because everybody loves me. I'm Charles Lindbergh. I'm an American hero. I'm the only person who can raise the issue of the Jews respectfully, and everybody loves me. So, and it, of course, it doesn't work out that way. First of all, we get attacked on December 7th, 1941. So there's no ginned up excuse like the Lusitania during World War I to drag us into World War II. And second, he couldn't say it. He couldn't bring it up. Anybody who mentioned the Jews in 1941 was going to get attacked, particularly Roosevelt's biggest political adversary. This was a chance to destroy his political adversary. So Roosevelt attacks Lindbergh and destroys his reputation. And for the last 80 years, we sit around thinking that this man was a terrible anti-Semite. But he wasn't an anti-Semite. And I'll tell you why he wasn't an anti-Semite.
That's one of the questions. Yes, but yeah, so we can discuss that now then.
Okay, so the anti-Semite always says that the Jews do not have the same democratic right to advocate as everybody else. It's always a conspiracy. We're always using our money to change people's opinions. Charles Lindbergh says twice in the Des Moines speech, it is our right to advocate for our interests. That's antithetical to anti-Semitism. No anti-Semite ever said that Jewish Americans have the same democratic rights as everybody else. The second reason he's not an anti-Semite is because the anti-Semite in 1941 blamed the Jews for their persecution in Germany. Even Franklin Roosevelt at a press conference in 1940 said it was our fault. We dominated Germany's professions, which was a lie. So Lindbergh comes out and says, this isn't being made up. This isn't a media conspiracy. The Jews are being persecuted in Germany. Of course, he'd been to Germany, so he knew it. He'd seen it with his own eyes. So those two things, to me, are antithetical to anti-Semitism as was defined in his era and as it is defined in every era. No anti-Semite says the things that Charles Lindbergh said. He said he admired the Jews. Historians call that perfunctory. But in 1941, that was not perfunctory. People did not go around saying they admired the Jews. People said the opposite. They said they didn't like the Jews, but what Germany is doing is inhumane. He said that the persecution was real, and he said that we had the right to advocate for our own interests. And those are three philo-Semitic statements that have been ignored for 80 years and considered perfunctory, but I don't consider them perfunctory. I think you have to, a man's legacy are the good things and the bad things, and you can't just dismiss good things that people do.
I don't disagree with that aspect of it, but there are other statements too. I mean, talking about, undue Jewish influence and talking about, yeah.
Overall, I think what he said was true. Now, he did say some things that were anti-Semitic in hindsight. I'm not going to say they weren't. But so did Harry Truman, so did Franklin Roosevelt, so did Eleanor Roosevelt. So did a lot of people that we consider American heroes today, said quite a few anti-Semitic things also. His basic argument was that there were Americans who had influence over American public opinion. That was absolutely true. Jack Warner is the archetypical Jewish man in the media. Now, he owned Warner Brothers, and he did not care what it cost. He put out anti-Nazi material. And that anti-Nazi material was very important in convincing Americans that Hitler was bad and England was good. Remember, America had millions of German Americans. It had millions of Italian Americans who sympathized with their countries. It had millions of Irish Americans who hated the English for very good reason. And we lost either wounded or killed about 500,000 men in World War I for absolutely no reason. And the average American blamed that on the English because the English dragged us into war. It was Jack Warner who convinced the American people, for the most part, that the Germans were bad. This was something else. This was a different level of evil. This wasn't the persecution of the Irish or the colonization of India or all the complaints that Charles Lindbergh raised against the English for the things that they had done. And they were all true. It was Jack Warner who convinced the American people this was a different level of evil. This was beyond anything anybody had ever seen before. And Lindbergh was telling the truth. We did have a lot of influence in American public opinion and on American foreign policy. You know, it doesn't sound like a lot of Jews in the Roosevelt administration compared to, say, the Biden administration or the Trump administration. But for its time, Roosevelt had more Jews in his administration than anybody had ever seen before. Prior to Franklin Roosevelt, there had only been a single Jewish cabinet member under Theodore Roosevelt. So Roosevelt has a Jewish cabinet member named Henry Morgenthau. Ben Cohen is what you would call today the press secretary, who's Jewish. Felix Frankfurter was appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court. He had direct access to Roosevelt. So from Lindbergh's opinion, we did have influence on the government. Unfortunately, Roosevelt was ignoring these people. And more importantly, what Lindbergh doesn't know, what no American knows, is that the Jews who have access to Roosevelt are not asking him to enter World War II. The Jews who have access to Roosevelt are asking him to get the Jews out of Germany. But Lindbergh doesn't know that because nobody's speaking publicly. If Lindbergh had known that, he might have agreed. He got scientists and doctors out of Nazi Germany. But prior to 1939, he didn't care what religion they were. He understood that there were engineers and Jewish engineers in Germany. There were Jewish scientists in Germany. There were Jewish doctors in Germany who were very, very valuable to the American people and to the war effort. And he might have supported an effort to get the Jews out of Germany. But he didn't know what the Jews were advocating because nobody was speaking public. And if nobody was speaking in public, that wasn't his fault.
I just go, like I said, you know, I looked at the book and very fascinated, but I mean, I still see all of Lindbergh's statements. And I don't know about the influence. I do agree with Jack Warner, obviously, about that this was a very specific evil that needed to be eradicated, that the United States should get into the war. And I know Roosevelt had his own things. We're going to go to Roosevelt in a second about that. But let me just go for your book. Okay, let's go back to your book right now.
Okay.
So by having the title, okay, A Convenient Villain, I mean, it automatically suggests, right, that he was unfairly portrayed, as you've been saying. So first of all, in your mind, what do you see as the biggest misconception about him? Is that the thing about being anti-Semitic in your mind?
I think Lindbergh is blamed that we didn't enter World War II until December of 1941. And I think Lindbergh is blamed as being an anti-Semite. He's also often called a racist, which would be another podcast for another time. I think that he takes a lot of the blame for what rightfully belongs to Roosevelt. I think Roosevelt, according to the Immigration Acts of 1921 and 1924, German citizens, Austrian citizens were entitled to a certain number of visas. Half of those visas went unused. Of the ones that were used, half went to non-Jews. There were hundreds of thousands of Jews applying for these visas. There, in the city of Stuttgart, Germany, there were 850 spots. 300,000 Jews applied for 850 spots. Why did half of those visas go unused? They went unused because the U.S. State Department deliberately did not give them to Jews. There's no example of a Christian, a native German not getting a visa or a native Austrian not getting a visa. It was the Jews that didn't get the visas. And if you want to do some math, I can go through the math and we can calculate how many visas went unused and what percentage of the Jews murdered in the Holocaust really belonged in the United States. And I think that's the villain. Roosevelt is the villain, not Lindbergh. Lindbergh had his First Amendment right to engage in political advocacy. He was wrong. His worldview was wrong. There's no question. Roosevelt was right and Lindbergh was wrong. But that single speech that he gave in Des Moines 80 days before we entered World War II had no effect on anything. It didn't hurt anybody. It didn't do anything. In fact, it was the opposite. He was so hated as a result of the speech that you don't see any anti-Semitism during World War II. You know, it comes back, it always does. But during World War II, we had terrible casualties. We lost 500,000 men in World War II. No one blamed the Jews. Lindbergh made it so unpopular to blame the Jews that nobody during World War II blames the Jews for the casualties.
Well, I was about to ask you, and you already went into it about the contrasting, Lindbergh and with FDR, because I've also changed my opinion on FDR in the past, 10 years or so too, about, I'm much more toward the negative. So, so I was going to ask you to contrast them, but you've already started doing that a little bit.
So Roosevelt's State Department, the Secretary of State was named Cordell Hull, his wife was Jewish, which is a lesson for when we vote for people who have Jewish spouses or Jewish children, to think that actually means something, because
doesn't mean a damn thing.
It doesn't mean a damn thing.
Right.
So Cordell Hull orchestrates this campaign to not give visas to Jews and Jews only. And the man who orchestrates the policy is named Breckinridge Long, and he wrote memos, and these memos are public record. And they specifically say we can prevent what he calls German intending immigrants, which is a euphemism for Jews, from getting these visas. So if you run the numbers, these are the numbers, okay? There were about 500,000 Jews in Germany in 1939. The number of visas that went unused, plus the Dominican Republic has 100,000 visas it offers in 1938 that Roosevelt blocks, plus the United Kingdom offers 60,000 visas a year that Roosevelt blocks. If you add up those numbers, it comes out to about 500,000 Jews. So if Roosevelt had simply followed the law and not interfered with the two sovereign governments' offers, nearly every Jew could have left Germany. But that's just Germany. So we're just getting started, because that's just Germany. All the countries in Europe Jews wanted to leave: Poland, Italy, Hungary, Romania. Add up those visas, it comes out to 1.3 million. Mm-hmm. Add the two sovereign nations, that's 1.5 million. That's 1 out of every 4 Jews should have had an American visa. But that's first qualified come. That's not first qualified come, first qualified served. That's still Christians getting priority. If it's first come, first serve, it's 2 million. 2 million Jews, that's 1 out of every 3. Okay, but what about the other English-speaking countries? How many visas did Canada issue to Jews between 1933 and 1939? How many Jews came to Canada? About 3,000. Even if you account for the difference in population, that's less than half of the number of visas we issued. And this is a country that's massive, that has endless space, that was recruiting immigrants in the 1920s when we weren't taking any immigrants in the 1920s. Why did Canada only take 3,000 Jews? Well, you just have to read the journal of William Mackenzie King, the Prime Minister of Canada, because Roosevelt didn't take any Jews. If Roosevelt doesn't take any Jews, I don't have to take any Jews. So let's add that up. Canada, Australia, South Africa, England, New Zealand, all the English-speaking world. How many Jews? 3 million Jews now. 1 out of every 2 Jews would have gotten out of Europe if Roosevelt had simply acted according to American law. What about non-English speaking countries? What about Brazil? What about Cuba? What about all these countries that could have taken Jews but didn't? Read the transcript of the Avion Conference in 1938. If Roosevelt won't take them, we don't have to take them. If at the end of the day, there's 2 million Jews in Europe in 1941, does Hitler really build an archipelago of concentration camps? Does he really take all those soldiers and all that coal and all that food and all those railway lines and use them if there's only 1 million or 2 million Jews? I mean, Jews are going to get murdered, no question. It's not Roosevelt's fault. Hundreds of thousands of Jews would have been murdered regardless. But the entire scope of the Holocaust falls back on a decade of moral turpitude on behalf of an administration that Jews overwhelmingly voted for 4 times, but never made demands of. It isn't that elected representatives didn't do what they thought was best in the national interest. They did it in the absence of the Jews saying, this is what we expect you to do. And that's the sad part of the story. It isn't Roosevelt's fault. It's our fault. We didn't advocate for ourselves. And that's the lesson.
Well, look, I read so many things about Roosevelt, between the St. Louis and not bombing the tracks and not taking in, the Jews, refusing the Jews so many times, with and not necessarily the ideas of the concentration camp, but the idea of how dangerous it was for Jews already in Europe. And Roosevelt refused. Like I said, my feelings have changed much more to the negative for Roosevelt the past. But
all we had to do was demand that he obey the law. That's it. Yep. We're not saying we needed special treatment. We're saying these visas exist. People are qualified or applying for them, and we need them. We need these people. But the 1930s, 2 to 3 million Americans were displaced during the Dust Bowl. Okay, these people were moving across the country. They had no medical care. They had no dental care. There was no pharmacy services. Germany is full of Jewish doctors and dentists and pharmacists. It was in our national interest to take these people. These people would have been a tremendous benefit to the United States, but nobody made that argument. And if they made that argument, I think Lindbergh would have agreed with it. Because in nowhere does Charles Lindbergh ever say we need to restrict immigration. He never says that in any one of his speeches. I've read all 20 speeches that Charles Lindbergh gave between 1939 and 1941, and he never says that we should restrict immigration to the United States. So I don't think he's the villain. Was he wrong? Yeah. Did he say some anti-Semitic things? Yes, he did. I don't think he's the villain. I think Roosevelt's the villain.
Look, I still think things would have happened in Germany regardless, but yes. But all right, let me ask you about this. Part of the book is about the contributions that Lindbergh made in the U.S. winning World War II. So yes. Can you talk about that a little bit before I go back to something that you just said before?
Yeah, so he goes to Germany 3 times and collects all of this intelligence. Now, this intelligence is in the public record. I did go to Yale. I did spend a week looking at his papers. I did find some things which are not generally well known. But the major intelligence reports have been in the public record for 60, 70 years. And if you're an aerospace engineer, you can follow the intelligence to the development of airplane engines. And the biggest one in my book is liquid-cooled engines. There are 2 ways to cool an engine. You can put it right behind the propeller, and the air will cool it. Or you can run antifreeze through the engine. And the Germans had developed liquid-cooled engines, and they let Lindbergh fly these planes. And the moment that I knew I had to write a book was when I took his journal and I looked up October 18th, 1938, and I read what he wrote about getting to pilot a certain plane called the ME-109. And I understood what he was saying was that this is the best airplane I ever flew. But unless you understand aeronautical jargon, you may not get that if you buy a copy of Lindbergh's journal. So he comes back to the United States and he meets with these engine manufacturers. And he not only tells them what kind of engines to make, he gets loans for them. They use his name to go to the bank to get loans to expand their factories. We enter the war in December 1941. We can make 1,000 engines a month. We can make 1,500 airplane engines a month. In 1938, we were making 8 engines a month. Okay, how did these companies get the money to go from making 8 engines a month in 1938 to making 1,500 engines a month in 1942? Where did that money come from? How did they build a factory? How did they hire people? How did they train people? They borrowed the money from the bank. Why would a bank lend them money if they didn't have a contract? If they had no military contract? They don't get a military contract till the middle of 1941 because they use Lindbergh's name. They say Lindbergh is going to back us. And then in June of 1939, the Kilmer Board, which is the future of the U.S. Air Force, puts out these recommendations and says the liquid-cooled engine is the future of American aviation, when the Army was not buying liquid-cooled engines. They were only buying air-cooled engines for airplanes. Lindbergh says that. Now this company, the Allison Motor Corporation, which is the only company making liquid-cooled engines, can get a huge loan from the bank and triple the size of their factory. So when we enter the war, we can make enough engines to fight the Germans. So I don't see how, and that's just one of many, many contributions he made. He developed the mask that the pilots wore, that my uncle wore, my great uncle who fought in World War II wore. He developed those masks. He tested those masks in very, very dangerous conditions. And he had no reason to do it. He was 42 years old. He was too old to be drafted. He had 5 little kids. And he's doing these experiments, taking planes up to 43,000 feet to see if these masks work. And in one situation, he passed out. And he passed out, and the plane descended 20,000 feet unpiloted before he regained consciousness. He took tremendous risks out of pure patriotism, and then he goes to fight the Japanese in 1944, flies 50 combat missions against the Japanese, when he was completely under no obligation to do so. My grandfather was 2 years younger than Charles Lindbergh. He didn't fight in World War II. He was an air raid warden. He walked around Queens, making people shut their lights off so the German bombers couldn't see Queens. Lindbergh went and fought. So I think he had some very good things that he did, and those are not recognized. He did say he was wrong, and he gave some very specious arguments about not entering World War II. I agree.
At what point did he feel that we needed to be involved in World War II? We needed to be fighting the Nazis or the Japanese.
So we get attacked on December 7th. On December 8th, 1941, he writes in his journal, if I were in Congress, and he could have run for office. He would have won. Mm-hmm. He might have even been the Republican nominee for president if he'd wanted to be. He says, if I was in Congress, I would have voted for war. And then on December 11th, 1941, when Germany declares war on us, he says, I will do something to help the war effort. I will, no matter what I can do, I will do it. And he does a lot to help the war effort, despite the fact that Roosevelt is doing everything he can to prevent him from having any role in the war effort.
So what did you personally feel about Lindbergh prior to writing this book? I mean, were you thinking along? I
expected that he was an anti-Semite. Mm-hmm. After all, my mother was an historian, and she thought he was an anti-Semite. Right. And that's all I heard growing up. I expected to have pity on him for what happened to his son, mm-hmm. and maybe cut him some slack. That's what I figured I would end up, when I finished this book, that's the way I would feel. Maybe I'd cut him some slack because he'd been so badly traumatized. And what inspired me to write the book was not the Jewish part. I started writing about the engineering part.
Right.
When I went to Yale and I went through all the drafts of the speech that he gave in Des Moines, and I could see that there was a lot of philo-Semitic stuff in those drafts. He really was trying not to be called an anti-Semite.
So he did feel the ramifications of his.
Oh yeah, he didn't want it. He didn't want to be he was a very stubborn man. He was never going to apologize to anybody. But he did not want to be considered an anti-Semite. He had Jewish friends. He did business with Jews. None of that inoculates you. I'm not saying, that he wasn't an anti-Semite because he had a Jewish friend. But I'll tell you, after I wrote the book, some of his grandchildren got in touch with me.
Oh, I was going to ask you about that if anyone from the family did. Okay.
And his granddaughter, Christina Lindbergh, who's the oldest granddaughter, so she knew him the best. She's in her 70s now. She said that when she was in college, she had a Jewish boyfriend, and he didn't care. Charles Lindbergh didn't care. He was very nice to her Jewish boyfriend. He didn't care. He never cared who you were. He didn't care. He writes things in the book, in his journal, about African Americans, mm-hmm. which are remarkably far-sighted in terms of their role in democracy, in terms of lynching. He didn't care who anybody was. He was, in a way, on the spectrum. He just wanted whatever it was that you were going to do, and if it was good, then he would support you. His grandchildren tell me they never heard him make a slur about anybody. And I grew up in the 70s. I remember my friends' parents. I remember how awful they were about black people, about homosexuals. I for a man of that generation in the 1970s to not say anything is remarkable. Mm. Whether you think he's an anti-Semite or not, I don't really care. He wasn't my grandfather. But you have to try to get an appreciation for what an unusual person he was and what kind of life he led and the contributions he made during his life, which were remarkable.
Well, yeah, look, I always thought that anyway, and your book made me think of a lot of other things as well. So when researching this book, so like I said, I asked you what you thought prior to writing this book. So when you first started researching this book, what was the first thing that you found out that made you rethink your previous perception?
He co-developed the first cardiac perfusion pump. As a cardiologist, I found that absolutely astounding. Mm-hmm. That a man with an 11th grade education, I made one major contribution to medicine in my lifetime, that screening test. That this man with an 11th grade education developed the first pump that could keep a human organ alive outside of the body astounded me. Because once you can keep an organ alive outside of the body, you can transplant it. And you can't transplant the pancreas if you don't know how the pancreas makes insulin. Is the brain telling it to make insulin, or does it know how to make insulin? If you take a pancreas out of a cat and you put it in a Lindbergh-Carrel pump and it keeps making insulin, you know the pancreas can make insulin on its own. Now you can transplant the pancreas.
Cool.
And that was, to me, that really opened up my mind to what I mean.
Right.
This is the most famous man in the world in the 1930s.
Sure. Yeah.
This is a man who could, make hundreds of thousands of dollars, add a zero for today's dollars, by doing commercials. He could do a commercial for anything, bread, shoes, anything. He never does a single commercial. He never advocates for any product. Here's a guy who could be dating movie stars. He proposes to a 21-year-old college student on the third date of his life. He wants to be left alone to sit in a lab working on a cardiac perfusion pump. This is what he wants to do. This is what he didn't want to be a political figure. He wanted privacy, is really all he ever wanted. So he was a very unusual man who accomplished a lot of things, and not all of them were good, but whose life is all good.
No, I agree. And look, I've seen that, you've talked about looking at history through the lens of its time instead of modern sensibilities, which I totally agree with. Sensibilities were different, laws of the land were different. But, even at the time, we did get to this part that he was a controversial figure. So you started talking about that a little bit already. He was an American hero. He was the most famous and most admired person in the land at one point, in maybe the world. So right. When did that perception start to deviate? Was it when Roosevelt started to kind of attacking him a little bit?
So in 1934, Roosevelt and Lindbergh have a public fight over airmail contracts, which is a footnote and not very important to your listeners. But Roosevelt already hated him. Roosevelt saw him as a political adversary who could beat him, and there were very few people who could beat him.
So that was the main thing that Roosevelt was worried about, electability.
Yes. Okay. So in 1938, Lindbergh is in Germany, and he's at a banquet which he did not want to go to. He's very clear. He doesn't want any social receptions. But the Germans throw him this banquet. He goes to the banquet. They give him a medal. He has no idea what's going on because he doesn't speak German. But what's he going to do? He takes the medal. It's October 18th, 1938. September 30th is the Munich Agreement. So everybody thinks there's going to be peace. November 9th is Kristallnacht. Right in that window. Before Kristallnacht, after the Munich Agreement, they give him this medal. He has no choice. He takes the medal. Roosevelt attacks him. Mm-hmm. Harold Ickes, who was Roosevelt's Secretary of the Interior, starts attacking him in 1938. He is not an isolationist in 1938. He's working for the United States government. He's in the German embassy because Roosevelt's State Department asked him to be in the German embassy. He's with the ambassador. He's working on behalf of the Roosevelt administration. He gets this medal, which is very controversial. People talk about this medal all the time.
Yeah.
He doesn't give back the medal. That was a mistake. He should have given back the medal. I agree. But he can't not take the medal because it's a very, very critical point in foreign policy. If he doesn't take the medal and there's a big blowout, he's going to get blamed for World War II. So Roosevelt starts attacking Lindbergh before Lindbergh has expressed any political opinion about anything. Lindbergh comes out against no. Roosevelt tries to bribe Lindbergh. Roosevelt tries to give Lindbergh Secretary of the Air Force. He tries to give him a government position. Lindbergh won't take it. Lindbergh does not want to be beholden to Franklin Roosevelt. So then there's this speech he gives September 15th, 1939 on the national radio, and he sets himself up as the major opposition figure to Roosevelt. Now, Roosevelt has not said he wants to enter the war. Roosevelt may never have entered the war. There's no evidence that he would have ever declared war on Germany. We got attacked. If we don't get attacked on December 7th, 1941, and if Hitler doesn't declare war on us on December 11th, 1941, we may have only fought Japan.
Right.
We don't know that Roosevelt ever would have gone to war with Germany. And I'm not saying that it wasn't his job as president of the United States to determine what was in our national interest. It was. But Roosevelt was not advocating going to war. Roosevelt was preparing for war, but he never said he was going to go to war.
I think he also pushed things in that direction.
Yes, he did. He did.
Yes.
He supplied England with weapons, which he was right. Lindbergh was wrong. He also supplied the Soviet Union with weapons, and that's a question for today.
Right.
After all their war crimes and all the things that Russia has done was that really in our interest or not? I mean, politics makes strange bedfellows.
Sure.
War makes strange bedfellows. They were on our side, so we supported them. But his opposition to aiding the Soviet Union was certainly with some merit.
So since the book came out, have you found anything? This is, I was wondering, have you found anything to either enhance or contradict any elements of the book?
No, I enhance. Yes. I mean, I keep finding new things. I keep finding new books. I keep writing new books. I keep reading new books from different people about different aspects of World War II. What has happened is that the non-Jews are fascinated. I can get as many speeches and podcasts as I want if I wanted to talk to them exclusively. Pilots and engineers and veterans and medical history who are actually interested in medical history. I've spoken at the Mayo Clinic. I've spoken at the National Museum of Health and Medicine. I've spoken a lot. It's the Jews who don't want to hear what I have to say.
I was about to ask that. How's the reception been in the Jewish community?
It's been hard. It's been very, very hard. It's been very hard to get across that I am Jewish, that I'm not using this as a credential, that I have a kosher home and I speak Hebrew and I got an award from the Israeli government. I have 4 children. They've all been to Israel. Well, 3 of them have been to Israel. I am Jewish and I do speak Hebrew and I am a Zionist. And I'm not defending Lindbergh because I like him. And I'm not defending Lindbergh because I want to make excuses for him. I don't care whether you like him or not. I want to get across a lesson. I wrote the book for us. I want to explain to the Jewish people that there are lessons in what happened. And the lesson is that Roosevelt was not our friend.
I agree with that. I do agree with that. Yeah.
And we didn't hold his feet to the fire. And we didn't speak up for ourselves. And I still see examples today where we don't speak up for ourselves. And that's the lesson. Non-Jews can be our friends and they can advocate for us, but they can't take our place. They can't speak for us in the absence of us speaking. And when I review the criticism of Lindbergh's speech, and Lindbergh got a lot of criticism, and some of it was very valid. But the problem is that the critics were often anti-Semites themselves. Mm-hmm. And they had not advocated for us. They had not advocated for us for 10 years. While Hitler suddenly they're it's like the scene from Casablanca. There's gambling going on here. Suddenly they're our friends. Suddenly they want to criticize Lindbergh for being an anti-Semite when they had said nothing for 9 years of the worst oppression in world history. And the answer is, look, they were Roosevelt's allies. They saw an opportunity, and that's politics, and I get it. But we had to be the ones to speak for ourselves and say, the problem is that Roosevelt isn't complying with the law. If you let the Jews into this country as designated by the law, entering the war is not in our interest either, because then we won't be able to get the Jews out. And if they had said that, if we had said that, if my grandparents' generation had said that, then I think Lindbergh's speech would have been very different. Mm-hmm. I think he would have given a very, very different speech if he had known that our primary interest was not entering the war, but getting Roosevelt to comply with the law. So let me give your listeners a story that they might find interesting. November 1942, we invade North Africa. It's the first U.S. military operation in the European theater. So we invade North Africa. Who's running North Africa? The Vichy French are running North Africa. Where are the Jews? The Jews are in concentration camps in North Africa. Does the United States free the Jews? No, they don't. November 1942, we do not free the Jews in concentration camps. Why not? It's a couple of reasons. We want the Vichy French to feed them. We're afraid that the Arabs of North Africa will revolt. We've got all sorts of reasons why we don't free the Jews in North Africa. What do the American Jews do? They say, we won't take this. We will not take this anymore. They protest. There's statements in newspapers. They put out national statements. The U.S. Army starts to release the Jews. We could have done something differently. We could have affected history. We could have gotten Roosevelt to comply with the law, but we didn't say anything. That's not Lindbergh's fault.
No, I agree with you 100% on that. I mean, that's what I keep going back to Roosevelt. And if and I keep saying this now, even with what's going on in today's world, if, if we're not speaking for ourselves, why should anyone else?
Right.
Right. So, and look, I admit to you, like, when I had that same preconceived notion of Lindbergh growing up, and, I don't know how I feel now. I do know. I do think there was, for myself personally, there's not anything there. I do think there was elements of anti-Semitism within him, of course, but I have looked at him in a whole new way also since your book, and so I'm fascinated. And just that to have a conversation, and I don't know why other Jewish organizations wouldn't at least have a conversation to learn something, or even whether they want to believe it or not believe it, that's up to them. But
it's just hard to get over that hump. It's just hard to get past that preconceived notion.
I get that. I get that, but still, you would want to look. I mean, I grew up, Roosevelt's a saint, and I'm far from thinking that now. so I, like I said, I look at Roosevelt in a very negative light right now.
I think he was a great president. I mean, I think he managed. I think his actions during the Depression were good. I think he won World War II. You can't argue with the fact that he won World War II.
Right.
And that was certainly in the Jewish interest to win World War II.
Yep.
I don't think he was a bad president. I think he was a great president. It was our fault because we didn't hold his feet to the fire.
I'm with you, but there was also an element that you knew things that were going on and you still refused to do it. And I think that was only, if it had been anyone but Jews, it would have been different.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Now, we were afraid of being un-American. That was the Jewish fear. We weren't going to be Americans. Today, it's dual loyalty.
Right.
And it's the same issues that keep us. We certainly do better now than we did in 1941. There's no question. But this fear of dual loyalty is paralyzing.
Right.
So can we give you an example where I don't think we're speaking up for ourselves? Okay. College campuses.
Yep.
Okay. Now, I'm a graduate of Columbia University. And,
I was going to ask you, looking at Columbia now as opposed to when you went there. So I went to these meetings of the Jewish Alumni Association. Mm-hmm.
Jewish students it wasn't a free speech issue. There was vandalism, there was assaults, they were locked in a library, people banged on the window. When I read about Columbia, I don't see that. I don't see the violence, the trespassing, the vandalism. I don't see people talking about that. I hear people talking about, what I hear is, the Jewish students felt uncomfortable. That's what I hear. It's not a free speech issue. It's an issue that Jewish students were being intimidated and assaulted. And I don't hear American Jews saying that. I hear us saying yes, it's a free speech issue, but it's not a free speech. It has nothing to do with free speech. You can get, if people wanted to protest, they were welcome to protest as long as my kid could go to class and nobody would bother him. And I think we failed our college age students.
I think that there are Jews speaking up, but it's not. I do think it's way not enough. And the problem is that, like you said, there are people, Jewish people, also like saying, "Oh well, this is free speech," and when the crackdown occurs on campuses, there are far more people saying, "Oh, defending because if it's Trump inspired, cracking down on campuses than caring about what's happening to Jewish students."
I'm thrilled that he did something.
Me too.
Thrilled 100%. That he did something, but his interests are not our interests. He's not. He's doing it. They happen to be coinciding, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be speaking for ourselves. He's not.
We need to speak for ourselves.
He's not carrying water for us.
But I do agree at any point that we need to be the ones spearheading everything. And but I will take any politician that's willing to accompany that goal. So right now, you wrote a book about Lindbergh. So I'm curious now, since you've done all this already, and you still practice cardiology, right?
Yes.
So you still do it. And so, do you have any plans to write any more books? Because this must have been really unbelievably difficult to believe.
No, I don't have any plans. spend a lot of time trying to promote it. I spend a lot of time trying to speak about it. I spend a lot of time trying to arrange things like this podcast. And right now, for me, that's enough. I don't have any interest in writing another book. I don't think I could ever find another subject that I'm as qualified to write about. I'm an aerospace engineer. I'm a cardiologist, and I'm Jewish.
Right.
And I don't think anybody with those qualifications has ever written about Charles Lindbergh. I don't think there's anybody. Maybe there are other Jewish aerospace engineers who were qualified to do it, but engineers don't tend to write history books. So I was sort of in a unique position to write this book, and I don't think I'll ever be in a position to write another book that'll be that perfect. There are plenty of history books about Lindbergh. There are plenty of other people who've written about him, but never a Jewish aerospace engineer.
No, this is unique.
Yes, this is unique. I think I had I've spoken to the Lindbergh people, the Lindbergh family, since I wrote the book. And, they would like to defend their grandfather or their father. They can't, because they would just be called an anti-Semite. I can't credibly be called an anti-Semite. I'll put up my credentials against anybody's, maybe if Elie Wiesel called me an anti-Semite, I wouldn't argue with him. But I think I could put my credentials up against pretty much anybody as far as being an advocate for our people. And so I just want people to take an open mind and read it. And I get plenty of email from Jewish people saying, I liked your book. It was very interesting. He's still an anti-Semite. Fine. Fine. That's, I don't care. Doesn't matter to me. It didn't really matter to him whether people hated him or not. He lived in his own head and didn't really care what people thought about him. So why should I care? I would like to see some honesty. I mean, in my book, there's a lot of historians who have misquoted him, started quotes in the middle, told stories that were chronologically impossible about him. As a physician who writes medical journal papers, I'm used to a certain level of academic honesty. And it boggles my mind that historians can just make things up. And people don't question them. People don't challenge them. Everybody's got a bias. I'm not saying that somebody's going to write a history book about World War II and it's going to be completely, without the author's bias, obviously. But I draw the line at a lot of the misquotations. I mean, there's one historian who starts one of Lindbergh's quotes in the middle of the quote, and he puts in the beginning of the quote to change the meaning of what he said. And that's academic malfeasance.
I mean, I have seen that happen a lot now in the past, 5 to 10 years about history, taking things out, and just like we talked about before, looking at it through modern lens and attributing things that weren't necessarily true to, historical figures. But so going back to the book, what's the one thing that you want people to take away from this to rethink Lindbergh's legacy? Just to have an open mind? What's the one thing that you want?
To try to judge people in their era and try to appreciate him for the complicated man that he was. And then you can still hate him at the end, but we're allowed to hate him. We're not allowed to lie about him. we're allowed, because, look, our grandparents hated him, so we can hate him. I love my grandparents. I have no attachment to this man. I'm happy to hate him. I can't lie about it. And that's where you have to draw the line. Hillel said, if I'm not for me, who will be? I have to be for me. But if I'm only for myself, who am I? The truth is more important. This narrative that Lindbergh has is apocryphal. It isn't based on truth. It's based on stories that aren't true. And I would like people to know the truth. So the book is called The Convenient Villain. My website is convenientvillain.com.
Okay.
And my email is convenientvillain@gmail.com. And I'd love to hear what you think. Whether you read the book, whether you didn't read the book, I'd love to hear what your readers think. I find it fascinating to have discussions with them about it.
Are you on any other social media accounts too, or just the website?
Yeah, Facebook and LinkedIn.
Fantastic. Jon, I want to thank you for coming on. I mean, like I said, this was fascinating to me. This book was fascinating. Regardless, it made me take a new look at things. From my perspective, was much different than what the perspective of the book was, and so like now I'm like very up in the air.
Well, let me know what you think. Ask me questions. I'd love to hear from your listeners. People want to challenge me, do some homework, do some reading, throw some facts at me. This is a discovery for me also. This man is endless. The things that he did in his life.
Well,
Just
I
my
recommend
Bible.
people should read this. I mean, regardless what their thoughts are now, I think people should read the book. Very fascinating book. And again, so thank you for coming on.
Thank you, Jonathan.
So let me sign this out. All right. This has been The Jewish Lens. I'm Jonathan Rosen. And again, a very special thanks to Dr. Jon Rich. And please like, comment, and subscribe.
Thanks for tuning in to The Jewish Lens, where all items used was strictly kosher.